So AMRA ABADŽIČ LOWE on my right away here. She's born in Sarajevo. She's a historian with a degree from the Open University of the United Kingdom and has worked for Reuters since the beginning of the siege of Sarajevo. From 1992 to 1995, she covered every aspect of the war, walking on the front lines from hospitals, mortuaries, funerals to press conferences. At the same time, she, of course, performed daily chores, providing for her home and sustenance, water and food, firewood and candles. After the war, AMRA worked on for numerous non-governmental organizations, on journalistic, documentary and film projects, and for the organization Bosnia and Herzegovina Heritage Rescue, where she worked as a project manager. As part of the MES Festival program, Memory Module in April of 2022, I'm in a different time zone, 2022, her book Sarajevo, The Longest Siege was promoted, and today we'll be talking about it in more detail. Next to AMRA is Dr. Paul Lowe, who is an award-winning photographer and is a course leader for photojournalism and documentary photography program in Masters of Arts at London College of Communication. He is widely published. His work has been published in Time, Newsweek, Life, the Sunday Times Magazine, The Observer, and The Independent, among many other venues. He has covered breaking news the world over, including the fall of the Berlin Wall, Nelson Mandela's release, famine in Africa, the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, and the destruction of Grozny. His book, Bosnians, documenting 10 years of the war and post-war situation in Bosnia, was published in April of 2005 by Saki Books. His research interests focus on the photography of conflict, and he has contributed chapters to the books Picturing Atrocity, Photography in Crisis, that was published in 2012, as well as Photography and Conflict. His most recent books include Photography Masterclass, published by Thames and Hudson, and Understanding Photojournalism, co-authored with Dr. Jenny Good, published by Bloomsbury Academic Press. And on my far right, not politically, but simply physically, is Kenneth Morrison, who specializes in modern Southeastern European politics and history, with an emphasis on Serbia, including the Sandžak region, Montenegro, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. He has published widely in his field and is the author of Montenegro, A Modern History, published by I.B. Torres in 2009, Sarajevo's Holiday Inn, On the Front Line of Politics and War, published in 2016 by Palgrave, Nationalism, Statehood and Identity, Post-Yugoslav Montenegro, published in 2018 by Bloomsbury, and is the co-author of the Sandžak, A History, where he has also published chapters and articles in numerous edited books and journals. He has also edited memoirs of Conan Doyle, head of the European Community Monitoring Mission, and Lord Peter Carrington's representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and is currently working on the new book entitled Witnessing Existence, Reporting the Siege of Sarajevo. Oh, it's right there. It's right here. It's freshly out of the oven, yeah, with the renowned photojournalist, of course, and academic Dr. Paul Lowe. So I welcome everybody to this panel, and as you could hear from the biographies, this is a richly represented a panel with exciting, of course, views on what has happened since then, and how we can talk about it. So welcome to Bookstan, to everybody. Before we begin talking about the book itself, I would like to ask each of the panelists to tell us a little bit more about your individual participation in this particular book project, in Najduža, opsada. How do you see your role in it? How did you interact? I mean, I see the marriage has survived, so it's a good sign. It's prosperous, but also how do you see the kind of cooperation that you did, and are you happy with the results in the end? I mean, how do you reflect on that?
So, testing, it works. So my involvement with the book goes back to its very beginning, really. I knew that AMRA had been working on this for some time. I've spent a long time researching the siege of Sarajevo, and it was mentioned in my short biography there that I wrote a book about the Holiday Inn hotel, which then led on to a wider project working on war hotels in conjunction with Al Jazeera. Made a series of documentary films and then book about frontline hotels, essentially. And AMRA was one of the first people I interviewed for the Holiday Inn book because she had worked for Reuters. She'd been kind of right at the heart of that media operation within the Holiday Inn hotel. And one of the things that AMRA and I used to discuss is the available literature that there was. And there wasn't that much in terms of stories about the siege that could be easily digested. Most of you will know that there is a wonderful, huge piece of work created by FAMA in the late 1990s, which documents the siege of Sarajevo. But you can barely get this thing in your suitcase. It's so huge. And people just weren't reading it. So I bought several copies and took them to the university. People just weren't taking it out. It was too much. And we talked about the idea of, creating a book about the siege of Sarajevo, about the experience of ordinary individuals, their day-to-day existence, how they functioned, how they gathered firewood, how they heated their homes, how they had to run across dangerous intersections to get water. It's a really important book for me because it makes accessible what is a very difficult experience, an experience I think that's both hard to convey and hard for those that didn't experience it to understand. So I think the book makes a tremendous contribution in that regard. And I can see, of course, when I go to every bookshop in Sarajevo, that it's selling more copies than any book I've ever written. I know that to be true now. So I edited the English language version of the book. And it was, not in terrible shape, I have to say. It wasn't a huge amount of work. But that was my main contribution to the
Thank you.
to AMRA's book.
Thank you. Paul, you want to...
So yeah, I think as you said in the introduction, I think AMRA has a really unique perspective on the siege because probably more than any other single person that lived through that period, she saw every aspect of life during that period. Because, she was working with Kurt Schork from Reuters, who many of you will know, one of the leading journalists of the period, and he worked obsessively and continuously everywhere. So he was in the fire station sleeping at night, going out with the fire crews. He was on the front lines in Stoop. He was in the hospital, in the morgue, at every press conference, covering every aspect of life with the presidents, with politicians, with every important person in the city. And by his side almost all the time was AMRA, as well as some of the Reuters translators and fixers, but particularly AMRA. So she saw all the aspects that all the journalists saw. But more importantly than that, she also then went home at night to her family apartment, had to gather water, had to heat the water on a stove, had to find ways to take care of her family, to take care of her dog, live through that daily experience that everybody else was living through. So she really has, I think, a very unique perspective. And for me, I think part of, my role was encouraging her in actually getting that out and talking about that and thinking about that. I hope she won't mind me saying, but for a long time she was kind of expecting somebody else to write that sort of book. And it didn't come, and nobody did it. And it was sort of, I think you should do it. And she talked about it a lot. I think when you're writing a book, especially your first book, you're obviously very nervous about whether what you're doing is good. And AMRA wrote for quite a long time with this concept of working through these sort of short excerpts and things. And eventually she showed me a couple of them. And it's a nervous moment for somebody when you're reading somebody's text for the first time, and will it be any good? And I was, you read the first few words, you think, oh my God, this is really extraordinary. And I think what AMRA had really captured, which I think is very unique, is a real deep sense of the psychological lived experience of how it was to be here during the siege. Some of the details, some of the things that she's tapped into psychologically, emotionally about darkness, about love and friendship, about death, about the morgue, about animals. It's a really unique perspective. And I think, I was talking with some friends here from the city, and they agreed, or what they said was, you told us things that we kind of knew were true, but we'd never been able to articulate. And I think that's what AMRA's done really, really brilliantly with the book. And the other way in which I helped to an extent was choosing the photographs. Obviously, some of the photographs are mine. But what was very interesting is that what that process made us realize is that we missed a lot of things as photographers. There were lots of things we didn't even notice. So darkness, for example, we worked really hard to find a picture of night time. And I realized I should have photographed it, but I didn't. And we eventually found one, very thankfully, from Tom Stoddard. So we would like to thank all the photographers as well that contributed to the book.
Thank you. AMRA, please, yes.
Well, I simply don't know what to say now because they obviously said everything, which I intend to say. As they pointed out, there is actually quite a lot of material on Sarajevo and on a siege, rightly so. The reason that I even started writing this book was exactly that. As they said, I simply felt there is no book around. I mean, there are some, but something that would, in really easy way, explain people what happened. Something that a younger generation wouldn't get scared of. Because if younger generation, they see something which is like 400 or 500 pages, they simply won't even open it to start reading. And that was a problem. There are books that I as a historian, find really fascinating. It's, for example, a book on the UN and black market in Sarajevo during the war and everything. But those are really, really particular subjects, and you really have to be very interested in subject itself to research that much. People would ask me very often, what would you, if people would come here and I would meet them through for different reasons, what would you recommend I read? I honestly simply didn't know what to say, because you just, you can't say, well, do take the book, as Kenneth said, it's an amazing, famous book, they do take something, just 1,400 pages, and you're in Sarajevo for 3 days. You can't say things like that. And the reason it was very difficult to, and it took me this many years to write this, is once you think about writing, it was this fear simply that you will miss something. It is this huge subject that you feel unless you do it justice, it's really not worth doing, and also it's unfair to try even to do it. Then later on, once I developed the concept and of each chapter and how I want to deal with that, it is my take and my explanation of how it went and what I went through. I'm sure I always, through the writing of this, I was constantly worrying that I will miss some things. Of course I did. Paul said I was in a unique situation to be in every one of those situations, 4 years of the war and working every day in every single field. But I'm absolutely sure that I missed some things. I think the core of the feeling of the war and core of each of the subjects, I talk about obvious subjects, as you know in a book, from the shelling to the snipers, to you have to talk, you can't miss those things. But I also talk about things that maybe some people find strange, but they were really important to me, and something that when I think about war, I think like darkness. Something that during the war, us who were here, one of the experiences was this complete and utter darkness constantly in a town. So I felt I really need to address that. As I said, people probably would say, oh, you could have added this, you could have that. But I have to say, which makes me quite happy, lots of people said, I really thought, will you mention this and will you mention that? And you did, which I think says that I kind of probably covered quite a lot.
Yes, well, thank you so much. Actually, a couple of things that I would like to pursue a little bit more have already been articulated, but perhaps we can take them a bit into more depth even. One of the observations, yes, that I immediately had as I was reading it is this interesting interplay between almost journalistic vignettes of what is going on and these very personal, intimate interventions in which there are really no answers, there are no numbers, there is no statistic, but there is a sense of emotional, almost psychological turmoil. So you are positioned there both as the observer and as a participant, and it's a very fine line that one as a writer needs to negotiate. And I wonder, how did you negotiate it? I mean, how did it feel to write? And were there moments where you just could not manage these two hats that you were wearing at the same time? And was there a struggle in the process of writing?
One thing that I decided before I write books, it won't be in a first case. It won't be about me. It won't be one of those books. I did that. This is what happened to me. This is how I'm talking. Of course, this is personal experience. It has to be, but I'm talking about people generally. All of us, our experience. I think I mentioned maybe twice because I couldn't really avoid it in a book. Something to do with me. I think in the end I just mentioned a couple of things about myself, but I really didn't feel right. I didn't want to, but I also didn't feel right to write about myself, because I didn't want this to become something like memoirs of my experience during the war. I was trying to put, of course, element. This is not historical because they also exist. This is not historical book in a sense on the day of whatever, 28th of 6th, blah, 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 that happened. There are books written like that by wonderful people who are quite often military. And those big books are written in different way. They have statistics, they have, from position of that was fired that day, or, that. Of course, I have to mention certain things. I have to mention how many shells fell on Sarajevo, just to get people feeling just exactly how bad it was. But it wasn't book first, it wasn't military written, but also it wasn't, I didn't want to write in a sense of memoirs. I just want to explain, if possible, how it felt to live. And also, before that, just to go back to what I was saying, why I write it, I felt very often that books written about Sarajevo, they were to extent lacking in more emotion, in a sense. Yes, this many shells fell on that day, but how did we feel that day when they fell? How does it feel? That's why in the book I talk about, because people say to me, "Oh, really? I didn't think about that." It was when you talk about when it fell, the shell lands very close by. How does it feel? Well, quite honestly, only somebody who was there in that moment knows how it feels. I say in the book, you feel like somebody actually punches you in the face because you get this huge impact from a shell, landing somewhere close, and does feel like that. And those kind of things I felt were important to be told by somebody who was primary source, somebody who was there, because I'm sure there will be academics and people who will be researching this material many years to come, but at the end of the day, they will not know the feeling of it, not just the fact of it, but feeling of it.
Paul, perhaps you can add to this, if you don't mind. I mean, the role of the visual element in it and how that enforces.
Well, I think AMRA had a very, very clear idea of the pictures that she wanted. So I tried to help in researching them and looking for photographers that we knew, and we discovered some really interesting work that we hadn't seen before. But I think AMRA writes in a very visual way as well, and she's conjuring up these kind of these scenes. And I think, as she said, what she did really brilliantly is talk in the kind of we voice, which is very rare. I think there are very few books written in that kind of our collective experience in the we, and it's almost a unique contribution, I think, from that point of view. And I think, the images that she conjures up, the combination of the photographs and then the writing, is very evocative, and it really does take you right back. But I think it's the really subtle details that she tuned into. Things like bumping in the dark, bumping into the corner, having to learn how to move around your own apartment in the dark. The idea of, she talks about learning the different kinds of calibers of shells, and then how tanks have different numbers than shells do, and you become a kind of expert in munitions. And those sort of very subtle details that she really tuned into, I think, are very, very important and very telling. And I think that's the difference between, as she said, a kind of history book and this real lived experience of people during the siege.
Yeah, so if you could add your own, in a way, positioning here as also as observer, but also as a form of insider. So do you feel that you were on a similar wavelength in that regard? I mean, or
I think what was very interesting for me reading the book, because I helped, so Kenneth did the second edit, I almost did the sort of first edit and read through the English chapters, and I definitely realized as I was reading it, wow, I never quite tuned into that. I know that's how it felt, but I never could articulate it. And that's what made me confident that the book was really going to be valuable and really important, was realizing in reading it that these were things that I knew had happened or knew that really was how it felt. But I hadn't been able to kind of articulate it myself. It kind of reminded you of how it was very powerfully, and And as I said, one of the strange things, I mean, COVID was a very strange period for obviously everybody here for all sorts of reasons, but I'm sure people remember walking the empty streets of the old town immediately took you back 30 years to when it was, during shelling and it was quiet and empty. And that really that was a very powerful, emotional sort of moment, because obviously Emma was writing this book during that period of COVID, and that was taking us back. And that, as I said earlier on, made me realize lots of things that were very obvious, and yet you didn't notice them. And I think that's what Amra tuned into very, very, very effectively in the book.
Thank you. So, Kenneth, what happens when a book like this, which is so localized, which is so much about being inside and experiencing something from the inside, what happens when that book gets translated into say, English? And so what happens with the target audience? What happens with the whole ambience of the book? And
Well,
how does it...
One thing I think Amra's book does very effectively is it takes the politics out of it. And I think one of the reasons why people find reading about Bosnia-Herzegovina, if you come as a complete external, the politics are complex. It's difficult to understand. It's difficult to understand, actually, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and all of the complexities therein. And it's difficult to understand post-1990, the political complexities in Bosnia. What led to a situation where you had the beginning of the siege in April 1992? The book doesn't really deal with the politics. The book is really about an individual's experience. And one of the great things, and probably the great strength of the book, is that you don't know that this is any one particular person. You did mention that twice you say something about your personal experience, but generally this is coming from the perspective of a citizen of Sarajevo who you don't know, who doesn't present themselves to you, and doesn't talk about the politics around the conflict, only about their experiences. And I think that means it's much, much more accessible to a wider audience. They don't have to get to grips with that complex politics. Amra mentioned a really good book by Peter Andreas, Blue Helmets, Black Markets. It's a really good book, but it's an academic book. And unless you have a grasp of the relationship between different factions of the HDZ or the SDA when they were formed in 1990, it's quite difficult to get your head around those dynamics. So a book like this really, for let's say visitors coming to Sarajevo, if they want a snapshot of what it was like to live under the siege and be able to absorb that relatively easily, and it's never easy, but relatively easily, Amra's book really does make that happen. It makes it accessible. And by removing the politics from it, it brings forth, I think, the humanity. And also, there is a tendency, and I think it happens in the West and among Western authors, to view Bosnia-Herzegovina as this country in a constant state of crisis, that the war is ever present and so forth. This is the experience of an ordinary person who wasn't involved in politics and is distant from politics, but politics imposed themselves upon them. And I think that's what makes it such a powerful piece of work.
Thank you. So just for the audience, for those of you who have not seen the book yet and have not had the chance to read it, the book is not organized chronologically, as this is already mentioned, but really more thematically. And of course, when you have a kind of thematic organization, then there are certain, if you wish, universal themes that appear, to which people who have not been part of the experience can relate to at some level. And so the book very effectively does that. It brings up topics that are relevant to all who lived here, but also topics to which those readers who have not been here can, in fact, can understand what and how to organize the experience. So, if you imagine the book now in a different format, if it were, you already mentioned this. There is a very conscious reason not to do it chronologically, and why that would make it a very different book. If you did, if you just imagine it now in this collage of many different books that have been written about the siege, how do you see the contribution of the book to the whole remembrance, to the whole issue of what happened, to the whole reconstruction of history? And I will move the conversation a little bit more to that between history and memory. Where do we locate? Where do we place the book in that in that spectrum, or in that process, if you wish?
Well, I think, as I said before, there are obviously historical books which deal with data. And it's not very, I mean, we live in time and age even before, obviously, this modern technology, but 92 was not that long ago. In a sense, everything is, we know what happened on every single day. And we know the grenades, we know what meetings. I mean, as I said, the problem is putting that in such a way that it's understandable to people and people to want to know. This book is, and that's why I wrote it, I felt it has to deal also with the emotion of it. And with some things that are completely, I don't know, people just don't think about those things. In a sense, this book has obviously has to have dates, has to have, it started on that date, it has to have this many shells at the worst day in Sarajevo was that and that. Of course, this is in the end a historical book in a sense. But also it has to deal with subjects which we kind of know them, but we don't know them. For example, to name one, let's say animals. What happened in town under siege with all the pets, what happened with animals, what happened with all of those. There is no such a thing as a historical book that is dealing with those things. How did children actually, I mean, yes, there was this number, 80,000 children were here during the war, but how did they live? People, because people ask me strange questions, maybe it's strange to me, not strange to them. I remember women saying to me, "Oh God, it's horrible. Why didn't their parents just kind of? Why would they ever let them out? Why would they ever let them out?" And honestly, I felt like I want to deal with why do you let out somebody for 4 years out of the basement? Because the people just don't. We had Corona for 2 years, and after 1 month, everybody want to go out. So what do? That's why I was saying in the book. You lock the children for 4 years in a basement, and put sandbags around them. What exactly do you do? So dealing with those kind of things, I felt people didn't. That's my contribution. The first personal feeling, feeling that, as Paul mentioned, I really felt that everybody had story to tell during the war, but obviously people couldn't tell every single story. You wouldn't have doctor who was working here during the war be on the front line. It would be ludicrous. Why would they? And people had usually 1 or 2 areas of life that they were moving into. But only a handful of people, journalists, were the one who would be in every situation. Why would anybody normal go to front line, to press conference, to morgue, to all those things in one day? Nobody would. And how would they know every story that is happening? Why would you spend time with fire brigades unless you're a fireman? But that was your job. So that's that kind of personal thing from many angles that I felt that I knew lots of people didn't have because they couldn't. Usually people have one area or a couple of areas they were moving in. Yes, if you had your job, but you also collecting water, this and that. But you wouldn't be exposed to other things. And that is, I think, important to explain in the different areas, but also to explain the feeling of it, not just the fact that it happened. Very often I see that written, it happened. Yes, it happened, but how did it feel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in other words, there is the element of history in it.
This is historical book, there's no doubt about that, but I would like to feel this historical book with emotion.
With emotions.
In which it explains, doesn't just said, well, it was dark. Yes, of course it was dark, there was no light. But this is how we felt it was dark. This is how we had to deal with darkness. This is how it felt when you have completely black street and everything is around you is dark and you can't function in your own home and you had to learn again, like a blind person would learn how to touch things and when things are and stumble first 100 times and then learn. Sometimes it's not just enough to say something happened. You have to explain how it felt if you're already there.
Nice, yes. So let me take that to a bit more, well, I don't want to say academic, but a bit more the issue around the discourse, particularly in the burgeoning field of memory studies, the unresolved tension between how do we deal with remembrance and how we deal with forgetting? And so what's the dialectic between memory and forgetting on the one hand? And on the other, what's the really relationship between personal memory and collective memory? So is this ever going to be resolved? And is this ever going to be, or rather it can be ever analyzed enough so as to be comfortable about saying that collective memory is something that we can count on, or we can count on collective remembrance, or do we always have to look at the muffled sort of voices or those that are not there or something that is absent? So I would like to hear your reflections that through the perspective of this book, through the framework of this book. In other words, how would you maybe discuss those now issues if you were now to talk to a group of academics who are discussing that with having this book in mind?
That's a very good question. It sounds a little bit like an exam question, but
Sorry.
I'll do my best. Interestingly, I teach a third year, final year undergraduate course on Yugoslavia and post-Yugoslavia. And increasingly now, the students I teach, they're in their early 20s every year, don't even know that the siege of Sarajevo happened. They know that they know about Srebrenica, because Srebrenica tends to get quite a lot of media coverage every July. It's covered by most of the mainstream media in the UK. But the vast majority don't know about Sarajevo. And when I explain to them that this city was essentially besieged between the 6th of April 1992 and the 29th of February 1996, when the siege was lifted, they're astonished that this could happen in a European capital and that the international community simply wouldn't do anything to change the situation. So I think there's a shame among the international community about what happened in Sarajevo. We mentioned Andreas's book, Blue Helmets, Black Markets, and it explains a lot of how the UN worked, for example, how the international community worked in Sarajevo, how they essentially became administrators of a siege. They weren't willing to break the siege, but they were willing to try and ensure that people didn't starve. But that was the length of their commitment. And I think there's a shame associated with that. It's become a kind of hidden history. Undergraduates are generally not taught, history undergraduates are generally not taught about what happened in Sarajevo. Almost no school child in the UK, or I guess in the United States, will know what happened in Sarajevo. But I think it's really very important to preserve these kinds of memories. We are, since February the 24th, now living in a different world. It's a different geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in. The kinds of things that happened in Sarajevo and in Srebrenica and in other places in Bosnia-Herzegovina are happening again and could happen again. So it's really very important that we establish a dialogue where that we educate, particularly our young people, about the horrors of the past and how best to get ourselves into a situation where we don't repeat them. Outside Sarajevo, when you speak to anyone in Sarajevo, of course they know about the siege, and the siege is very present here. But beyond Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's a really kind of a hidden story. And again, I think this is one of the great contributions of AMRA's book. I could give it to someone who doesn't know anything about Yugoslavia in its various forms, doesn't know anything about Bosnia-Herzegovina, but wants to understand the experience of life in a besieged city in the 1990s, not in the 1940s or during the First World War, but in the relatively recent past, and not for a period of 1 month or 2 months, but for almost 4 years. For me, and I teach quite a lot about the siege of Sarajevo, there are important lessons as a historian for us to draw about the siege, about the role of negative political actors, about the role of the international community, about the limitations of their ability to function in such a situation, about the role of geopolitics in such a situation, and how it can be that the international community cannot bring a war to an end after 3.5 or 4 years. Well, if we want to understand the dysfunctional nature of that, then I think by looking at the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the siege of Sarajevo in particular, we can learn a lot of very important lessons from that. Paul, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, and I think, the siege here obviously at the beginning of the siege, nobody expected it to last for that long, but because it did last so long, it became this kind of laboratory of human experience. And obviously we're seeing terrible things in the Ukraine, and we're seeing the beginnings of some of this response to that and how people become very creative and resilient in surviving and finding survival strategies in the Ukraine. But here, it was just 4 years, and I think that's what makes it really unique, is you had a modern European, cosmopolitan, educated city taken back to the Middle Ages. So people had to find strategies to get through the day, to survive, to find psychological ways to survive as well as physical ways. And that went on and on and on. So those strategies became more and more sophisticated, more complicated, more in-depth. Culture, the role of art and culture, the way that the citizens of the city kept on making creative acts and interventions that we all know about. And I think that's what makes it really unique as a story, as in terms of human history, really, that you had this incredible period of, resilience and creative resilience, if you like, creative resistance. And I think that's something that AMRA taps into very, very well in the book. And it's something that's, in terms of memory studies, again, this we voice is very unique. I think I've never really read anything that has that kind of sense. Most books are either, as AMRA said, a memoir, I did this, I did that, or they're written in that sort of more academic tone of they did this, they did that. It's very rare to read a book where it's about we. And I think that's what makes this book, in your sense, talking about memory studies, a very interesting bridge between the individual and the collective, between a sense of a lived experience of one person and the lived experience of a whole group of people. And I think what gives Amila the authority to write like that is what we said at the beginning, that she knew so many people, she saw so many things. And I think that depth of understanding and knowledge that I think it maybe took, I don't want to say this wrongly, but maybe took a while. I mean, Amila did a huge amount of research for the book. She didn't just write it from her own experience. She read literally every book there is to read, including, who has read the entirety of that FAMU book? Who's read every single page of it? Apart from Kenneth and AMRA. Probably the only two people, okay, Boba. So 3 people, but apart from that, it's, and so it's not a book that's just based on her own experience. It's a book that's based on very meticulous and detailed research over many, many, many years. So I think that's what gives it that authority. So it's the sense of a huge amount of research that went into it, but also the fact that AMRA lived through every moment of that experience as well. So I think, to answer your question from that point of view, this book is a very interesting bridge between the individual and the collective. And therefore, I think it'll be a very interesting case study to think through how we can tell these kind of stories, particularly how you can make this kind of story relevant to people. And AMRA hasn't talked about it yet, but I think maybe that's a good chance for her to explain that. I think the book is also written for young people. I think maybe that's something you might want to allude to, AMRA, and talk about a bit more.
Yeah, certainly that was one of my questions as to target audience, who we can open this book to and how we can go about that.
I would just like to say this. During the war, some of my colleagues from the war are here and we work together. I spent every single day during the war trying to send information out of this town about what was happening to us, because I felt that was really important. In naive, obviously, believe that as soon as somebody finds out what's going on, somebody will react. It's obviously delusional, but that's how I felt. But I felt I really need to pass on information. I really need to tell what was happening. I think myself and this whole generation after the war, we got really tired. We were worn. I just really didn't have any psychological energy to deal with that anymore. I went in some other areas in my life and built some different careers and things like that. Until recently, I started a couple of years ago, I started thinking, I'm quite angry actually, because there is no, the young people don't actually know what happened. The story of Sarajevo and what happened to us, I felt is dying down. I felt like we have I will not go now into our political situation and how schools are organized and everything. There is this black hole when it comes to siege of Sarajevo in the schools, because I know I have 2 kids in the school. And they don't learn anything about it. It's just because of the political situation that's not allowed to do. And I felt so sad by that. So it's up to their parents or somebody else, God knows who, to tell them some story. Will parents have something. Maybe their parents were not even here. Maybe they will tell them some stories that were really not true. Maybe they will. I mean, it's different when you listen from your, neighbors, friends, or something. And yet you don't have anything that you can look at it and say, "Okay, I understand what happened." But when I wrote this, I offered it actually to I offered a couple of chapters to my own son, 14 at the time. I said, if you wouldn't mind read a couple of those things, do you understand what I'm trying to say? And he said, yeah, definitely. I really understood what you're trying to say. And I felt now, after all these years, strange as it sounds, that it's up to maybe us who were original at that point, who were very young and who were trying to explain what happened here, to try again to help this. I think for me and for people, especially people who are not here, who died during the war, or people who died in the meantime, to pass on that information, to tell that story, not to let it be forgotten. And I honestly, for quite a long time, because it's a difficult subject for me, I didn't want to deal with too much. I was thinking somebody else will. As Paul said, I really did think. I thought, well, there were quite lots of people who are dealing with this, and there are still, friends. I'm sure somebody will write something or period. And then one day I just suddenly thought, okay, let me just think. For us who were 20 at the time, anybody much younger really couldn't, because they were not, old enough to realize actually what was happening, or had very kind of narrow, experiences. But for anybody like my father was 50. At the time when war was going on. He's now almost 80. That generation, they are not here, or they actually are struggling with health, with problems they're having. So again, I think there is this window opportunity, and this generation and this group of people who need to do something and pass on this and not let it be forgotten. Otherwise, it will be, because actually there is nobody else to do so.
Yeah. Well, let's really talk about that a little bit more now that we are, we have opened this subject, which is very painful and really challenging, because I think at some level we take it for granted that people know and that people remember, but that suddenly does not happen. I mean, when the war in Ukraine began, I was terrified, as I'm sure everybody else has been, that when they were talking about the war in Ukraine as the first conflict in Europe after Second World War, and suddenly feeling this gap of amnesia opening before us, and we just fell through it, and we are no longer in the map. And maybe we had somehow taken it for granted that there would be empathy with our situation for as long as we are around. But as you say, the generations, time just goes. Time goes, and it doesn't. It takes no mercy on anybody who is not participating. So, but then there is also the practical question and ethical question. Who do we entrust our memories with? I mean, where do we deposit our memories? Where is the place in which we can safely say, okay, I would like you to pass on the knowledge or the experience, and on top of that we have many different, of course, ways in which we remember the siege. 50 shades of remembrance, where you have somebody like you who was here all along, who was both working as well as being in the being a Sarajevan, being a victim of the siege, as well as being somebody who was giving voice to the victims. There is somebody like me who was out of the country, but nevertheless with family, close family here, which is another position. Then there are foreigners like yourselves who were here in different kinds of roles. So there are many different agencies, yet somehow we are still missing some kind of glue that keeps us safe, if you wish, in terms of this passage of time, in terms of memory project. So where do we, please, yes.
I mean, if I can just say something about the importance of documenting stories in people's lives. My first two books were basically political histories, and they were drawing upon archival sources. Some interviews with political elites, but primarily it was working with documents. That's what historians do. The third book I wrote was this book about the Holiday Inn, which ultimately led to the project on war hotels. It was the first time I'd really done any kind of oral history. It's the first time I'd documented people's stories. Now, that book took 3 years, and it wasn't particularly long. And one of the reasons for that is that it's all about trust. Does this person wish to entrust you with their story? Through both projects, actually, from the Holiday Inn book all the way through to the reporting of the Siege book, the interviews that I conducted would often last several hours, often entire days, and often they would become almost therapy sessions in which much of the material that you were gathering you knew you could never use because it wasn't ethically sound to use it, but you gained trust. And I think therein lies the difficulty with telling these difficult personal stories, is that if you're not yourself a writer and wish to convey them yourself, if you have to entrust somebody to do it for you, actually that's where there can be blockages in the process. And that's sometimes why it takes so long to do it. I had one experience, for example, when interviewing someone for the reporting the Siege book who had been injured, quite seriously injured, on the airport road. He'd never told his story. And this is almost 30 years after the fact. He comes to my house because he's more comfortable telling the story there than in any public space. The interview went on for something like 11 or 12 hours. He broke down on several occasions. We had to stop, we had to go for lunch, we had to take ourselves out of the situation. If we're going to deal sensitively with these stories, but be rigorous as well, it's a very, very time-consuming process. But I would say, as a historian, what's so important is documenting individual stories. The part of this book, the Reporting the Siege book, that I'm most proud of is not actually documenting the stories of foreign correspondents. Because, guess what? They're actually quite good at telling their own stories. They like to talk about themselves. The interesting stories are the local staff, the people that were cleaners in the Holiday Inn, that were receptionists in the Holiday Inn, waiters, the people that were drivers, satellite engineers, fixers, translators, whatever they were doing. This was the really interesting story about locals whose lives were changed unimaginably and how they adapted to that. And of course, many of them were really young. They were people in their late teens or early 20s that one year may have found themselves studying literature across from the Holiday Inn. A year later, they find themselves in the Holiday Inn, working for Reuters, being a fixer or translator or whatever. I think for the first time, we told those stories. And that's really important. It's not just about the Martin Bells or the Christiane Amanpours, because their stories are everywhere. It's about the people that lay behind all of that. But as I say, the process is very difficult. There's a lot of trust involved, and unless you can establish that trust, you're never going to be successful in that endeavor. And I think that's one of the reasons I spent so much time here in Sarajevo and nurtured those relationships, is because I don't want to be one of those academics who parachutes into a place and asks the wrong questions because I don't have the local knowledge or I don't have the knowledge of that individual person's life or experience. If you're going to treat this seriously, treat oral history seriously, you have to make a serious endeavor to know as best you can your subjects and treat their stories with the appropriate care that is required to get those stories out there.
Yeah.
So just following on from what Kenneth said about British school children or maybe American school children not knowing about the siege of Sarajevo, well, you can kind of understand that because, in a sense, it's a small part of an obscure bit of Europe they don't really know about. But I had the privilege to be invited to show my photographs from the siege of Sarajevo recently in Belgrade for the 30th anniversary, and we showed them in the Centre for Cultural Decontamination, which is, it's an alternative space, it's a more left-wing space, it's a counterculture space, it's one of the sites of resistance against the current sort of Serbian regime. And the people that came were young, smart, well-educated, youth activists, campaigners, artists, creative people. And I had the same conversation with 3 or 4 of them, people in their mid-20s, late 20s. And they all said the same thing without prompting, that until they were 20 or 21, it's not that the siege of Sarajevo was denied or that they were told stories that the Bosnians had been killing themselves and blowing themselves up and it was all fake news. They said, we didn't even know there'd been a siege of Sarajevo. So to imagine that in the capital city of our neighbor, Belgrade, with all of the connections that we have of music, culture, art, all these different sort of culture and languages, that somebody could grow up in that city just a few hundred kilometers away and not even know there'd been a siege here. I found that really, very difficult to understand and devastating news. I think that's one of the things about, most societies that commemorate these kind of events like the end of wars, they're commemorating because they actually won. And they settled it, and they settled the situation. If you imagine, in West Germany in 1975, 30 years after the end of the Second World War, the kind of commemorations of that, or the commemorations in Britain of the end of the Second World War, they were very different because one side had won and the other side had lost, and the side that had lost had to come to terms with that loss and had made peace with it, if they like, and they'd kind of resolved it and moved on and gone on to Bosnia 30 years after the end of the war has not, or 30 years the beginning of the war, is still in this limbo state because it wasn't allowed to settle those questions collectively and politically, and it wasn't allowed to settle it with their neighbors, it wasn't allowed to settle it internally. And I think most of us would have imagined in 1995 that Bosnia would be a very different country to the country it is today. I'm British, and one of the things I'm most ashamed about Britain is that some of all you here would have to pay 300 euros for a visa to come and visit Britain. That's obscene in my opinion. And I think the Western community, the European community, has really failed Bosnia in helping it make peace with its past and forcing it to come to terms with its past and be able to move on from that. And I think we're still, I did a book in 2005 about the post-war legacy of Bosnia, and things have not changed since then. That's almost 20 years ago. So I think that's one of the very difficult things, and that's why I think AMRA's book is so important 30 years on. It's not actually about the past at all. It's actually about the present. All the sort of things that are in that book are still very much part of lives today. Bosnians are still having to find creative ways to deal with the situation that they're in. People are trying to find ways to break the political impasse, to break out of the corruption and all of these problems that we're facing. So I think that's the sort of the reason why I think it's still very important. This is not a sort of just an exercise in history. It's actually an active process of trying to work with the past to understand how to move forward in the present. And I think that's why AMRA's book and hopefully my exhibition and other contributions that lots of other people are making, it's still a very live debate. It's not something that's just about something that's buried in the past. And obviously, we're going to be seeing that on Monday. These problems, these issues are still very, very, very relevant today.
Yeah, if I can just add something to that very quickly. The way that Bosnia is often portrayed in foreign media and Western media is this place that's in constant, political crisis. So I wonder if anyone's actually documented how many newspaper articles have been published over the last 10 or 15 years that say Bosnia on the brink. I mean, there must be hundreds of these. So there's this perception that it doesn't work, it's dysfunctional, that war is, just around the corner. And people don't bother to get to grips with the complexities. It's too difficult. I'll give you one example. I can't mention any names, obviously, because this is being recorded. But on one of my trips to Bosnia, I was working as a specialist advisor to the House of Lords International Relations Committee. And we were spending 2 days meeting lots of Bosnian politicians from the Federation, from Republika Srpska, and having discussions about, they were informing the Lords about the current state of play in Bosnia. And to be perfectly honest, although my job was to advise them who they were meeting, what they were likely to talk about, a little bit about their profiles, halfway through the day, most of them were falling asleep. They had no idea who they were meeting. It was so complicated to explain state level, entity level, cantonal level. They didn't know who they were meeting. We're meeting the Minister of Culture. Yes, but we met him this morning. Yes, but there are quite a few ministers of culture. So now we're meeting this Minister of Culture. It's so complex. It's easy for people just to, take the easy way out. Bosnia, it's overly complex. It's dangerous. It's always on the brink of war. It's convenient for them to peddle that narrative because it's really difficult for them to understand the institutional architecture. There's only one other country I can think of that's as complicated as Bosnia. It's Lebanon, which also has a very complex institutional architecture. So there's a kind of tendency for Westerners to see Bosnia in a particular way, and that's not helping the country move forward. Now, what's happened recently, for example, with the European Union, and the European Union opening the door to some countries but making it clear to Bosnia and Herzegovina that they're nowhere near the front of the queue. You know, I've spent a lot of time in Serbia, in Bosnia, in Montenegro, in Albania. Bosnia really is in many respects further forward than Montenegro or Serbia. They still have serious problems, particularly when it comes to certain chapters of the acquis. But Bosnia is always left behind. It's always constantly going to be in the waiting room. Paul mentioned the fact that £300 it costs to get a visa to come to the UK. I have lots of, possibilities for PhD students to come and study at the UK. I'd love to have them. They're coming from different parts of the Western Balkans. I can't have them because we often don't have the funding and the visas are so expensive. I often end up doing my PhD supervision here rather than them coming to the university. We need to do something about that. We need to make it easier for this kind of exchange to take place. I shouldn't say this, but I don't want to publicise the British Scholarship Trust, but we do offer short-term scholarships for students in the region to come and spend 2-3 months in the UK so we can begin at least to establish relationships and dialogue that can be ongoing. And that's just a small fund, but it's so important because we really need to keep the options open for young people, talented people, who want to go and study elsewhere. We need to make this possible. At the moment, the doors are pretty much closed for political, but also for economic reasons, and that needs to change.
Yeah, just as a comment, I wonder how much this question of complexity is part of the ongoing narrative about the region as being incomprehensible, and therefore let's dismiss it. It's this, the paradox of at the same time everybody in the Balkans being looked at or represented as being all the same. Oh, they are all the same. But at the same time also, oh no, they are so different they have to kill each other. So are they the same or are they so different that they have to kill each other? So there's this dismissal that seems to happen historically and as a matter of convenience, as a kind of excuse not to get involved, and then putting up real obstacles such as the visa issue, such as all the political bureaucratic issues to in fact isolate further. So it's really quite depressing to hear that. And
yeah, I mean, sorry to be so depressing.
So in the recent Roe versus Wade debates, an American politician said, "Oh, this is the Balkanization of America," and obviously Yugoslavia gave the rights to women to abortion far before the Americans did. So it's that kind of idea of this exotic, crazy place off in the corner of Europe that gets forgotten about, absolutely. And that's sadly the EU's position as well, as Kenneth so well articulated.
Yeah. I would actually perhaps continue this conversation in a somewhat different way and ask you directly. What I find about your book very comforting is that there is all this amidst all this despair and the devastation and deprivation and the horror of the war. There is constantly space for creativity, and there is constantly the beams of light that show that people actually were very resourceful, self-reliant, and reliant on the community to in fact manage. And you talk about the gardens in Sarajevo that made people survive, the culinary experiments, the fashion, the cultural resistance. So in other words, the rejection of victimhood, of that role as a victim, and gaining agency and creating agency in the worst of conditions. What happened to that? I mean, how is that agency now in post-war situation managed? And what do we do now? We need agency again, not to be the victims of this dismissal, this exoticization, this removal from world politics.
I think in no uncertain terms, what I say in the book is, in the end of the day, yes, with the help of NATO, in the end, Sarajevo the siege was lifted and everything. But in the reality, through all the time, we could mostly rely on ourselves. This expectation that somebody will come rescue us, somebody will do this, I think that very quickly within a war, people realize we have to be resourceful ourselves. And when, in every segment of life. If we want to survive, we have to grow our own food. We have to fetch our own water. We have to find somehow some way of providing enough heating just not to freeze to death. If I talk about culture, really was extremely, but I think people say it's kind of a miracle, but I think it's normal. In the extraordinary situation, people do turn to extraordinary things such as culture. It was very important to have cultural events. I don't think ever since then did we have that many theatre performances, exhibitions, everything, because we really need some outlet, and we really needed to feel at the time that we are human beings. At the time, I talk a lot, and that's one thing that people mention all the time, but I will mention it again, the way that we looked, the way that we dressed, the way that we behaved. You would really expect us to walk around in the rugs and looking like some kind of post-apocalyptic society or something. People really did put the best clothes they had. They dressed the best possible way. They wore, if they possibly could, because I said we all looked like some oversized fashion show because we lost so much weight, so everything was everything was too big. All the clothes would look like we borrowed from somebody else. But it was really important to keep, and in the end of the day, yes, with help of everybody, yes, in the end, siege was with all the artillery around Sarajevo. It wasn't really, realistically. During the war, we kind of had this, because you feed on the informations, and you feed on rumors, and you feed on wishful thinking. Every single day we can make a break and break the siege and things like that. In reality, now looking exactly how big the circle around Sarajevo was, it wasn't really possible with this little bit of weapons that we had, and we needed somebody to come and help us. But with everything else, we did it ourselves, quite honestly. And I think after the war, and even now, we just have to do it ourselves. Obviously, I don't know, I always say maybe we watch too many Hollywood movies in which, oh, this is great injustice, and somebody will come and rescue us, and somebody will make it better. But it won't. It won't. If we want, same like to go back to the book, if I want people to know about what happened, and I'm very upset that people, only 30 years on don't know what happened. No, never mind in Belgrade. I'm talking about here. If they don't know what happened, then I need to do something about it. Then I will really try to make my voice heard, and I will write a book about it. And in Bosnia, for some reason, and I will not really go really deeply into political reasons why we are maybe sometimes not most popular nation in the world or country or whatever, we actually have to rely on ourselves. And we do have extremely intelligent, resourceful people, and we are managing. I'm tired of all these people also very often coming like, when they come from outside, I read Bosnia is over on a brink. Well, we are always on the brink of something. Well, we keep on living, we are always on the brink, and we will keep on living. And probably, I really don't believe any other war will happen because it's not in interest of anybody. But yes, it is like that. But we will again rely on ourselves. We will manage to, this handful of people somehow will manage to get, we will get through somehow.
So I don't want to, I know you said that this was, and you emphasized several times that this is really not the I story, but the we story, the kind of participation in common cause, common destiny, if you wish, common situation, the condition. But I would like to, if you don't mind, I would like to personalize it a bit more. Just to actually tell everybody, just before the panel, AMRA was telling me a story about a chicken during the war, which was actually quite a remarkable story, which I haven't heard the end of it. But I would, if you don't mind, take us back a bit to the siege, to that period. And, maybe not, you don't need to tell the chicken story, even though it's a very interesting story. But if you think of something that, can you think of something that as you look back now at it, you say, oh wow, that was quite a remarkable thing that I did or I didn't do, or an experience that I had that seems so real, but also so far away at this point. I mean, are there moments of the siege that you remember remarkably as
the thing is, with this distance and being that young, most of the things that I feel like about siege, I feel it wasn't real, quite honestly, even though I lived through it. One of the really good things is, and why lots of young people were working as a journalist then, photographers, and working as translators and everything, because when you're young, you really are invincible. That's how you feel about yourself. Of course, it's not true. So in every one of those situations, you feel like, I don't know, you just feel too valuable to yourself, I guess. Nothing will happen to you. When I think back on things, I'm thinking, really, I was completely insane most of the time. Realistically, jumping from one front line to another, going here, going there, somehow everything feels, I can't actually tell one story, and there are some stories that I can tell you, but they're so unbelievable. I know that happened, but I don't honestly think people would believe me it happened. I always thought with my very close friend Paul Marchand, and unfortunately it has passed away and he's not here to confirm this story, but we were going on one day on assignment and we were just in front of actually Galerija Novi Hram on that street. In his car, and he was very proud to always have, some journalists had kind of armored car, he had a soft car, it was something that he was like, I'm not going to drive in an armored car. Alfa Romeo, white one, during the war. And I remember that scene. As I said, there are so many really unrealistic things. And I remember in front of us, the shell landing. And it sounds crazy, but that's exactly how it happened. Basically, just in front of us, I can see this bolt of light hitting the street, about 2 meters from us. And he stopped the car, and it does actually happen in slow motion, just in case somebody is wondering, it does happen in slow motion. I don't know, obviously haven't died, so I don't know if your life goes between your eyes, but it does happen like that. And I can see this kind of hitting down that and kind of flame coming up. That's how you see it when it really hits very close. Mm-hmm. And kind of, it's like volcano coming. And I'm thinking, because it is so close, and your brain is still working.
You have stopped the car at this point.
The car has stopped, and it's kind of, you can see it in slow motion. Obviously it's split of a second, but honestly, it feels like it happens for 10 minutes, it doesn't. And you're watching it up, and you're thinking, oh, okay. So, as people said, because I interviewed many people before that, and they said when they were hit by shrapnel, it didn't really feel, because it's fresh wound, so you don't feel while wound is still hot, you don't feel pain. So I'm thinking, well, we are really dead now, but it wasn't actually that painful even. So it's okay. And I just look at him. He's always wearing white shirt. It was his kind of a trademark. And I look, and he doesn't have anything on him. I'm looking myself. We are completely okay. And I just look behind like this, and the building behind us is completely gone. Wow. Later on, I researched about that. Apparently, if you're at an angle of 30 degrees, you're perfectly fine. So if you, if you can, it just kind of hits like this and flies over. So if you're really close to it. So there are lots of those stories, if I'm honest. He's not here to confirm. And, and when I say to people, they look at me like I, kind of Martian. Some things I have on camera. Like that day on a cemetery when I was in a cemetery burying the children from the orphanage. When I was actually, it's first day that I put flak jacket on me. I was hit directly by a grenade myself. So I have footage of it kind of knocking me down and everything, and the flak jacket breaking on me and everything. So that I can tell that story. Other ones, people probably think this as the years are passing by, I'm becoming delusional. So there are those stories which are too strange even to tell. So I didn't even try to put them in a book.
But this is interesting. This is precisely what Kenneth was just talking about. How do you entrust? Do you trust your own memory? On the one hand, you do, but you also don't. As you say yourself, I don't have footage to confirm it. So it's almost as if one has the issue of trust with one's own memory, not just with those outside of us. Yeah. And so, I'm sure that everybody has stories like that.
Absolutely, everybody has stories like that.
I have a story, but it's not believable.
Yes.
And what do I do with it? And they accumulate there. they are everywhere, and they end up like a story or a book of fairy tales in one's life.
Yeah, I mean, that's problematic. People's memories, particularly after 30 years, are not necessarily accurate. And I know, for example, when I asked for dates or for specific events around that particular thing that they'd experienced, it was getting quite hazy, you know, after 2 or 3 decades. The best you can try and do is to give them, to remind them of the context, to remember what was the events that were happening around that particular day or around that particular moment. And that sometimes sparks something. But you're right. It's, in many respects, when we're documenting things 3 decades after the fact, it's imperfect. Memories are flawed. You know, all of our memories are flawed. When we're young, we think about things in a completely different way. So, you know, memories we had of what happened at 19 or 20, we might see those things very differently when we're 35 or 40 or whatever. So I think that there is an imperfection there. I still think, however, it's incredibly important to document those stories nevertheless. Amra mentioned something really interesting about how dignity, personal dignity, was really important as a form of resistance during the siege. One of the great stories about the Holiday Inn was that, now the Hotel Holiday, was that all of the waiters wore their, every day, their jackets, their bow ties, their white shirts were pressed. They still served silver service, the old way they were trained to do. You know, for the 1984 Winter Olympics, everyone was trained for a month to do silver service in advance of Juan Antonio Samaranch's first visit, 6th of October 1983. To them, to those staff, this wasn't just them being professional, it was a way of them maintaining their personal dignity. And those small stories actually turned out to be extremely important insight into how people deal with the kind of deprivation that citizens were suffering in Sarajevo. To go to work, to put on the bow tie, to put on the press shirt, and regardless of the fact that there are shells going off outside or sniper fire just outside the door, you maintain a professionalism and a dignity as a way of demonstrating your humanity. So it's those stories, those human stories, that are particularly important to document. I often think we give far too much space to political elites, to journalists, no offense, to tell these stories on behalf of people. Often, some of the ordinary people don't have a voice. But I'll tell you one thing. One person who I learned more from interviewing was the head of housekeeping at the Holiday Inn. I believe she's now passed away. She was the person who was responsible for cleaning Radovan Karadzić's room that he inhabited for a month prior to the shootings on April the 6th. She saw what was going on in that room. She saw who was coming, who was going, how much alcohol was being consumed in those days leading up to 6th of April, just how febrile it was inside that particular space with him and his closest advisors and his bodyguards and so forth. No one else had that insight. Now, she would never have told that story. Had she never been asked, she would never have told the story. But actually what she provided me, and I was able to articulate on her behalf, was an extremely important insight into the state of mind of those people prior to what happened on the 5th and 6th of April. Now, that's an exceptionally vital contribution, and it helps us to understand better what happened on that particular day. So these stories are hugely important.
Absolutely, yes, and definitely, I mean, we still, even as historians, we have a problem of opening up the field and saying, okay, what sources do we use? I mean, where do we find information, and how we allow those alternative voices, if you wish, those marginal voices, such as that one, actually become more present in the historical narrative and historiography. And it's a disciplinary challenge. And then it translates, of course, on the way in which people look at their own memories, and they think, well, this is not really important, whereas every information is important in this mosaic of remembrance.
I'll just answer that very quickly. History is changing. The way that we interpret sources, the way that we write history. Do we really need to know what General Lewis Mackenzie thinks of the current political situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina or what it may have been 10 years ago? Actually, no. We need to involve more people in the writing of history. And if you want to document it properly, you have to maybe work a little bit harder to find your sources. But this is a challenge. I mean, great man history is still predominant. You know, the history of political parties, the history of political elites. We need to try and move away from that a little bit, to tell history from below rather than history from above. But I don't want to dominate the discussion.
Just to say that AMRA did tell me that story about her and Paul during the war, so it's not a memory that she's invented, I can tell. But I did really want to pay tribute to that whole generation of young people, so, you know, Boba, AMRA, Dina, so on. Because without them in this conflict, and also in almost every situation, without the fixers and the translators, and they are very typically coming from that kind of space. You know, I'm sure it's the same thing is happening in Ukraine now. When I worked in Grozny, it was very similar. Without that kind of person who will help, in fact, not even help, actually, they were telling us what was going on, basically. I mean, don't forget that the journalists would come and go, you know, even the BBC, even Kurt would come in for a couple of months or a month and then rotate out again. And it was people like AMRA that were here the whole time, that had all the connections or built all the connections, that could find the stories, could find those sources, and could really kind of make the connection between the journalists who were coming and the people of the city. And I think it was always very impressive how well turned out all of those translators were as well. I mean, the women of Sarajevo in general, as everybody knows, made a huge effort to, as an act of resistance, to wear makeup, to paint their toenails, to keep their clothes clean, to wash their hair. And I remember many times sitting with foreign reporters, friends of mine, and being berated by the translators for, you know, why have you not washed your hair? Why are you wearing such ugly clothes? You know, the worst dressed people in Sarajevo during the war were the journalists, undoubtedly. And, you know, I remember once that I think it was you, Ahmed, telling a couple of the well-known female reporters they should go and get themselves some nice dresses, and they actually flew to Ancona to buy some dresses and some cheese and come back again and sort of so they could actually look, you know, like proper people. You're going to go and interview somebody, you want to dress well for that situation. So that was a really, I think that they're the unsung heroes, and I think that's something that Kenneth has done very well in his books, and I think we tried to do in Reporting the Siege as well, is to tell those stories of not just the famous journalists, the people that you see on television, but all that infrastructure and all those people that make that possible, make that happen.
Yeah, thank you, yes. So I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience, but before that, I have one final question for each one of you, and that is, okay, so now the book is out, and we wish it best. Now it's out there, it has its own life. But if you were to write the book, if you had the chance to do it over again, is there something that you would add, take out, do differently? I mean, be your own critics now, if you are comfortable with it.
If I was to write a book again, no, I wouldn't change anything. No, the thing is, once you finish something like this, it's better not to actually read again and try to fix it. I ended up doing that myself once I was writing it, and so I could just tweak this little bit, and then you go God knows where. I mean, not even comparing myself to actors and things like that, but they always, it's been very interesting when people talk about very famous actors. I don't ever watch my own movies because I always find lots of faults. That is true. This book obviously could have much more, and these days I sometimes get certain thoughts and like, oh, I should have maybe put that, and I try really to push it away. Yes, I could have put much more, and I could have done much more, but then it wouldn't be the same book. Idea was, for me, when I started doing this, I had really, really strong idea exactly how many pages approximately this book will have. And I said it'll be about 100, 120, but not more than that. That other book in which I would go into details about all those things that I want to, again, that would be a book of 300, 400, 500 pages. And it would completely be opposite of what I want to achieve. That would be the book that younger person, somebody who is 15 would run away from. That would be a book that somebody would pick up and say, well, I would like to read, but I don't have time to do it. That would be a book that would be focusing on a certain group of people that like history, that read history, but not everybody else. And I think we, in culture, we have, as Paul and Kenneth know me, I'm constantly going on and on about opening things for wider audience. there are certain books and there are exhibitions, everything. They're for very small audience, but let's open for big. This book was meant for somebody who doesn't know anything about it, wants to know, and really won't feel intimidated reading it. Hence, also, as I said, there are 9 chapters, stories. I can actually understand that somebody doesn't want to know anything about it. I just open housing. Maybe somebody doesn't want to know anything about housing. How difficult it was to live in Sarajevo, and how housing was a problem. Fine, just skip that chapter. Read something else. Maybe somebody is not particularly interested in animals. Okay, but at least get, if you don't read every 29, read at least 15 of them. That other book would be very different book, so it definitely wouldn't go in that area.
I think with the books I've done, books normally are kind of, you might do a second edition, you might make a few minor changes, but the arc of the book, the narrative, the structure is pretty much fixed. I think what's interesting about photography is it's not, and I've obviously been working with my archive of pictures from the war, and I'll be relatively brief, but I think it's been a very interesting process. So when I was making the pictures at the time, I was shooting them predominantly for a magazine audience and I was looking for what I would call the noisy pictures, the dramatic pictures, the kind of ones that just grab your attention and, oh, wow, that's amazing, because that's the kind of audience you're trying to attract. When I did the Bosnians book in 2005, I was looking for quieter pictures. I was looking for the aesthetic a lot, the photographs that were very photographic. And now coming through again, I'm almost more interested in the kind of ethnographic details and the anthropological details of how people dressed and what they carried and where they moved and so on. So with photography, it's a little bit different because you have this raw material. It's like a kind of deck of cards, and you can put them in different combinations. You can make different sort of houses and suites and so on. So I think photography is a slightly different process of editing. And I think, as somebody who's working with work from 30 years ago, and I'm looking at another photographer friend of mine at the back there, our archives are very strange things because there are kind of lives, they're these visual representation of all these things that we did. And they're still there, they're kind of living objects of their own, they have their own kind of life. So I think that's something interesting about the way that photography works and looking back at an archive and how you can rework that and remine that and represent it.
Thank you. Yeah, you raise a really interesting question about, when you're writing the book, you're living in it. And the end product, sometimes, as an author, for example, Amra said she doesn't read her book. I don't read mine. Because once you've been through that process, you've done the best you possibly can, and you've delivered it. I don't pick my books up off the shelf and read them. Oh, God, no. Because I might find a typo or some mistake. And believe me, everyone who's published a book knows that every book has typos. Even if you read the great works, I don't know, of Shakespeare or whatever it might be, you'll find a typo in there somewhere. No matter who the publisher is, no matter who the copy editor is, no matter who the author is. Nevertheless, if you do find one, it's like a stab through the heart. I'd rather not read the book. So I rarely look at my books once they're published. Because for the author, you live in this world. It completely absorbs you. And if writing isn't something that utterly absorbs you, you probably shouldn't do it. Because you need to live in this story for a long period of time. And it's a strange schizophrenic existence, because you also have to have a normal life. Your partner probably is not interested in, the journalistic infrastructure that was created in Sarajevo during the siege, or, frontline hotels. But, you have to enter into that world, and you have to exit from that world. You have to find a way to do that. And that's one of the, great challenges of being a writer, particularly when you're dealing with hugely emotive issues. It's really difficult, but in terms of the finished products, I think that the most important thing, certainly about Amra's book, about the work that Paul and I have done, and certainly the more recent work I've done on war hotels, which is, if you don't read the book, please watch the Al Jazeera series, which you can find on YouTube. I think one of the powerful things about that book is we gave a voice to those that previously didn't have one. And if I could do it all over again from the very beginning, I would probably interview a lot less journalists and a lot more, people working in the hotels. The one thing, of course, that we can't change is the passage of time. And so many of those I would love to have interviewed for this book are no longer with us. There's one particular character I would love to have met. His name is Harper Brown. Now, he was the manager of the Hotel Europa in Belfast. Now, the Hotel Europa was bombed 33 times by the Provisional IRA over a period of about 20 years. Throughout that period, Harper Brown managed the hotel. Not one person died in the Hotel Europa, despite the fact there had been so many bombings. And, you know, he made sure that that place operated, regardless of the circumstances. He was a remarkable character. He was always beautifully dressed. He loved jazz. He had a perfectly clipped moustache. He was quite a character. Now, if I could have met one person that features in my book, it would have been him. There's another character called Yusuf Nazal, who we did meet, who ran the Commodore Hotel in Beirut. And Yusuf Nazal was a fascinating character because he understood, as a hotel owner in Beirut, where's the business? Well, the business is the journalists. So what he basically did is he turned the Commodore into a press bureau where it had telex machines and, you know, all of the infrastructure that journalists needed to function in Beirut. So remarkable stories of remarkable people hidden from history hitherto. These are the great success stories in which, you know, the things that you can achieve through writing. I would say as well, this is my first commercial book, War Hotels. So normally my books have got lots of footnotes in them. Hence, anyone who's not an academic tends to look at them and think, oh God, no, this is definitely not for me. So I'm hoping that, you know, I've managed to find that balance between, you know, it's still credibly telling the story in an intellectually challenging way, but also making it as accessible as possible. And I'm not sure if that answers the questions I was originally asked, but
it does. It very much does. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for all the insights that you have provided in the course of the panel, and of course discussing the book in a contextual way, not just in a kind of textual sense. And I would like to invite everybody to ask a question, make a comment. I'm sure this is, and I must say that I would like to emphasize again that I'm grateful to Bookstan for foregrounding the topic of the 30-year of siege, after the siege of Sarajevo, and it is a very important forum for us to bring out as much material as possible and to strategize on how to move forward so that the next 30 years are not spent on forgetting about the siege more than it already has been. So please.
Yes, thank you. I have two questions, and the first to Paul and Kenneth, and then the second for AMRA. Paul and Kenneth, when I listened to you concerning the journalists and the Bosnians you were speaking about, I had a little bit of impression that you had on the one hand the foreign journalists, and the Bosnians were the fixers, the translators, or the employees. But what about the Bosnian journalists? I mean, we know the role of Oslobođenje, we know the role of Dani, we know the immense role of Bosnian war reporters, Bosnian photographers, Bosnian journalists. So perhaps if you could develop a little bit on that, and also on the relation actually between international journalists and Bosnian journalists. That was my question to you. And a question for AMRA. I haven't read your book yet. I totally understand what you said about this importance, about this we perspective in difference to the I, individual perspective, and the they perspective from the historian. I'm just wondering about one point, because I think the we perspective starts, of course, from the point of view of a collective experience, which is similar for most of people living here. And I just want to question that a little bit. It's the same for the corona pandemic. Somebody said at one moment, we are all in the same boat. And somebody answered, no, we are all in the same storm, but we are not in the same boats. We are in very different boats. Some are bigger, some are smaller, some are more secure than others. So my question to you would be, by choosing this we perspective, so to what extent could you nevertheless enter in differences within the experience of a siege? Because obviously not everybody experienced the same way the siege. So that would be my second question for you.
Okay, thank you. Nicholas, for a great question. At the beginning of this project, we did consider actually writing a sort of history of journalism during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I spoke actually to Kemal Korsbakic, who's documented much of what happened, particularly in Bosnia. There's a brilliant book he wrote about Sarajevo and about his experiences working with Oslobođenje during that period, and the pressure he came under from various political factions at that time to move the editorial line of Oslobođenje in a particular way. The story of journalism, I think, is a really important one, and domestic journalists play a huge role in that. It just became too big. So I started the project, interviewed a number of people who worked at Radio Television Bosnia and Herzegovina, some people who'd worked actually in Pali for the television of Republika Srpska, and then, of course, foreign correspondents. And it became quite clear quite quickly that it was going to be a massive project. Some other people have been documenting it already. Media Center have done some good work, actually. Bern, the last dispatches, have done some good work recently on this. They're continuing to work on this Reporter's House project. I felt this project could become too big and too clumsy if we focused on all journalists that were reporting the siege. And what I found most interesting was actually how foreign correspondents managed to create an infrastructure that in a besieged city, which was quite remarkable. So the airport, the PTT building, the Holiday Inn, the morgue that they would use, the Opća bolnica, or what's now the Opća bolnica. The top two floors of that was the Vojna bolnica at the time, were taken over by Sky News. When they came into Sarajevo, they filmed from the top floor of that building. So the scenes you see, the footage you see of the Parliament building being shelled, it's actually in May 1992, there were almost no foreign correspondents in Sarajevo at that time because they'd all left on the 14th of May. They'd evacuated from the hotel complex in Ilija. So there was an infrastructure there that was built and it was created and it was used and it allowed the story of Sarajevo to be told. Local journalists didn't necessarily have the means to cast the story much beyond Bosnia and Herzegovina. Foreign correspondents did. So we decided to narrow the project to look at foreign correspondence. And although it's called Reporting the Siege of Sarajevo, and any of you that are writers and have written books and deal with publishers know that you don't make up the title of your book. Your publisher decides on the title of your book. So for example, the book Sarajevo's Holiday Inn on the Front Line of Politics and War, I wanted a colon inserted, but it wasn't possible for marketing reasons or because it couldn't be found easily on a Google search. So I ended up having this horribly clumsy title. So it was called Reporting the Siege of Sarajevo, but we make it very clear at the beginning that this is the story of foreign correspondents and how they reported the Siege of Sarajevo. But that's not in any way to diminish, of course, the very important role played by people like Kemal Korsbakic and others. And maybe that's a project for the future, part 2, if you like. I hope that answers your question, Nicholas.
Yeah, it's also, I think, as Kenneth said, we wanted to narrow the focus, but we also wanted to broaden it out because I wanted to situate this as part of the history of journalism more broadly and the international media. And the conflict in Sarajevo marked a very interesting point in the shift from analog to digital, in the armorization of journalism, in the way that and a lot of the ethical questions that journalists faced around the journalism of attachment. And they are, to be honest, they weren't questions that the local journalists, by and large, were dealing with because they didn't have that, as Kenneth said, that access to global media. So absolutely an incredibly important story to be told. It has been told, I think, in some other spaces very, very effectively. And we did, through the way that we looked at some of the local journalists that worked for international media. So Daniel Kristanovic, for example, features quite heavily in the book. Obviously, AMRA and the other translators and so on. But we also wanted to situate reporting the Siege of Sarajevo was a crucial turning point in a whole range of different issues around the way that journalism has changed in the late 20th century, coming into the 21st century. And to tell that story, we had to tell it through the eyes of the international media because they were the people that were reporting it. So you have the rise of 24-hour live two-way news. You have, as we said, the kind of professionalization of the security, of the safety and security of journalists, and these massive ethical problems that we were challenged with this whole idea of what do you do when you're telling the story and the political elites won't listen to you. So in order to tell that story, which that's what I think makes the book relevant beyond simply the description of what happened here during the siege. That's what makes it, in terms of the history of media, more relevant. And that's the story we had to tell through the international journalists. So again, as Kenneth said, huge respect to the incredible work that Oslobođenje and so on did during the war. But that wasn't the story we wanted to tell. I think it's a story that somebody else should tell, but it wasn't what we were trying to do. And that's the point about these books. The same with AMRA's book. You cannot cover everything. But what you can do is make your contribution to that story, and then somebody else will fill in the other gaps, and somebody else will make those other contributions. And again, that's very much what AMRA's book does in literature around the siege.
I mean, your point is absolutely, I absolutely agree with it. Even if you have, let's say, one of the stories of the book, I'm talking about water, I'm just giving this example. Yes, we all had problem with drinking and water and everything, but obviously it was different for everybody. And for some people it was 5% of problem, for some people it's 105% of the problem. You might actually just live next door to the beer factory, in which case the water was outside your door. Or you might have actually, when the war started, for some bizarre reason, had 100 huge barrels of 300 liters in your basement, and you fill them all and you're happy for the next year. Or you might have had some, I don't know, trolley that you can easily pull, or you might have bicycle. I mean, those are details that, change everybody's perspective and everybody's stories, but it will be too difficult to go into that. Even such a small things actually change completely the story. What I say is that we generally, most of people had problem with the getting the drinking water. For some people, it literally will be just across the street. For some people, will be walking 4 or 5 kilometers a day. It certainly was not the same having to go and fetch water if you live in a basement apartment and if you live on 15th floor, since the elevators were not working. There are so many different issues, and of course we were not in the same boat. I mean, and that's just one of the examples. For every one of those stories, as I said, you can go into. It's not. I can say people who are living in the center of town were, most likely much more hungry than people who were living on town borders. Why? Because people who live on town borders usually have some gardens. They even have some chickens. They even had some other animals. On the other hand, people who were living in a town borders were much more dangerous situation because they were much closer to front line than people who are living in center. So you have to find some kind of in-between things. Not, every single of those situations was actually quite different for everybody else. Because give or take, you could be really lucky, and some people were just lucky. They were living. I talk about housing. If you were lucky, in inverted commas, before the war to have basement apartment without any possible view, and you basically had your own shelter for 4 years. And if you're very unlucky to be on 15th floor on penthouse, then what was good before the war suddenly became that trap during the war. So yes, there are those, but generally I'm talking about. Otherwise, this would have, never mind 1,400 pages at 3,500 pages.
Thank you. And I think that on that note, we need to break because it is 2 minutes to the end of time. Thank you, the panelists. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, AMRA, for writing the book. Thank you, Paul, for contributing to it, and Kenneth for, of course, redacting it in its English version. I think that AMRA will be happy to sign now that she has practiced signature. And have a good afternoon.